Welcome to the Mega Blast Podcast. I'm your host, Jason McDonald. My goal is to get to the truth through conversation. The Mega Blast Podcast is produced by Arts and Opinion, an online journal housed at the Archives of Canada. Visit us at artsandopinion.com. I hope you enjoy today's guest. So, welcome, John Jordan. Thanks for coming on my podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jason.
So, I'm here with John Jordan of Me, Mom, and Morgentaler fame, and also a great NDG resident or proud NDGer, right?
Sure, yeah. I grew up in NDG from the age of 4, and I've lived there most of my life, and I'm very much ingrained in the community there.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that quickly. It occurred to me, I've had a few NDG people. I want to plug my own podcast here a bit. Roy Epen, he ran for the Conservative Party of Quebec.
Right.
He's an NDG guy. Tanya Maria, another political person, and another guy called Neil Mukherjee, who's a local guy.
They're with Team CDN NDG.
Yes, I don't know if you know them.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. For a while, I was doing some political podcasts, but I found that so tedious. You know, after the election, I was like, I'm just sick of that. I want to talk about stuff like music and stuff. Yeah, so the objective of this podcast is to talk basically about two things. The first thing we want to go through is mental health and some of the issues you've struggled with, and talk about it generally. And then we're going to get into some music stuff later on. So starting with the mental health, we could start with just saying, what exactly is it, in the sense that, is it possible to say that there's a standard for a mentally healthy person, or is it all subjective?
I think everyone has moments in their life where they struggle with mental health issues. And even for healthy people, it's an occasional thing that they struggle with. But for people who have mental health conditions, it's something they struggle with chronically. It's something that's not just a few isolated incidents in life here or there that may have been triggered by life events,
The sort of, someone breaking up with a boyfriend or girlfriend, you get depressed. These are, so you would sort of divide people who have a condition. You might use the word condition.
Yeah,
right?
Condition. Yeah.
So that implies some sort of, perhaps a chemical issue of some kind in the body, perhaps. That would be one. That's how you categorize yourself. I don't want to get too personal about you.
I was diagnosed as having bipolar disorder. I'm trying to train myself to say having instead of being.
What's the difference?
When someone says I am bipolar, it's
like you can't get out of it.
It's like their identity, It's like
right.
I am.
I'm not
bipolar.
laughing at that. It's just, you're right. It's funny.
And versus saying I have bipolar disorder,
right.
It's a condition that you have, but it's not who you are.
Yeah,
it doesn't define you as a person.
Yeah, that's a very interesting little distinction, because there's something. What sounds like what you're saying there is you don't want it to control you, even though it's going to affect your life.
It does affect your life, and it does control you very much. That's the harsh reality of it,
Right.
People who suffer from bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, OCD, a lot of these things. It really does. It's really hard not to let it take over your life and control your life, and a lot of my fortunes in life have been dictated by my mental health and the conditions I've been in. It's affected a lot of the decisions I've made in life and what I've been able to do and what I've not been able to do. So
has it been? You say fortunes? It's affected your fortunes, so clearly that means you've struggled with it and had difficulties.
Yeah, well, I've lost pretty much every job I've ever had, or I've walked away from every job I've ever walked away
Okay.
from for mental health reasons.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah. But what I was getting at is, has it also had any, like, on, because then when you're bipolar, there's these manic swings. Do you think those upper swings, have you ever managed to capitalize on those and write
for
music
sure,
and do
yeah,
stuff like that?
exactly, yeah. I've
Yeah.
been, you know, the reason bipolar is linked to the arts so much. There's so many people in the
Yeah.
arts world who have mental health issues, is just because of how creative you can be when you're,
Right.
not even full blown manic, but hypomanic, where you're just like kind of just leaving that balanced, stable state and starting to go into mania, can
Mm.
be incredibly fruitful and creative. And some people are able to maintain that state like all the time, be it with like substances like caffeine or sugar,
Mm.
can put you in a hypomanic state,
Interesting.
or
Wow.
or street drugs or what have you, So some
Well,
people,
drugs definitely. I mean, cocaine, for example,
yeah,
is known to basically, from what I understand about many of those street drugs, as you're calling them, they chemically induce that sense of very positive feeling when you really feel like you're connecting with a person or doing something you enjoy doing. It kind of replicates that cocaine does, as I
yeah,
understand
it's
it,
just
right?
it's just a
It's
dopamine explosion
dopamine,
in
right?
your head.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you get this inflated sense of well-being.
yeah, yeah.
And
The essence of the question is quite deep. It's sort of like, I remember once I was having a discussion with a guy I know, and he was sort of decrying the use of things like Prozac and stuff. And he said, imagine if Van Gogh had taken, sort of. And there's this idea that, like, an artist like Van Gogh or some genius like that, who clearly he must have had some mental health. I mean, you'd
mhm.
probably agree. If you just look at his paintings, it's like there's something funny going on. So it raises the question: how much of your success as an artist could be, like, you've suffered from this, but it may actually be the reason that you're a musician as well. Like, it's a very
Yeah, it's
difficult.
well, it's the old cliche. It's a blessing and a curse, right? Yes, there are positive aspects to it. You can have some incredible epiphanies when you're manic, and you can
Yeah,
have some life-changing thoughts that continue to persist long after the manic episode
right.
has faded. You can completely alter your way of thinking about something. Um,
It's a very hard problem because you don't want to be living in this manic state going up and down like that, because, as you mentioned, you're losing jobs and you're walking away from jobs and all this. On the other hand, it seems to help you in a certain sense. It's very difficult. I don't really know how to think about that, is what I'm trying to say. I don't know how to put that together, whether it's something, because I can see the negative side. I can also see a positive side. Do the two, must they go together? Like, do you have to accept both, or is it possible to just try and get to a state where you're able to get to that hypomanic state often enough but not go off the rails? And
it's really tricky. Like, I've
yeah.
never been able to do it, that's for sure. But I think in a way I almost did, because from about 2015, 16, up until this year, or 2022, last year, um, I had an incredible creative output.
Yeah.
Like, I was writing every day. I was recording and releasing a track usually once a week or two or
Wow.
three times a week. Um, and that went on for like 5 years.
And you were
And I was
stable.
stable that whole
Yeah.
time,
Right.
except for I had a 1 week hospitalization in 2019, like right in the middle of it. Um,
Okay.
and
But sort of like that, just, it's almost like brackets. I mean, like, that's one small event, because those are very long stretches
Yeah, it
of
was a
time,
long
right?
stretch for me to be
Yeah.
stable. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Um,
So that, yeah, so it is possible, at least, to get to some kind of a stability where you're able to have a good output and feel good about yourself, and from a day to day, because, as I understand, I mean, that's a long time to go 2 or 3 years without any. serious
Yeah.
down. That's
And I
it's
felt
right.
I felt like, I felt that that was normal at the time. But now that I'm looking back on it from where I am now, after I had a manic episode in early 2022, and I was hospitalized in March, and then the crash of depression that came after that, that I'm still in now. Now, from the perspective of where I sit now and what I'm able to do now, which is like next to nothing, I'm like
Well, you're here
useless.
doing
I'm
this.
doing
Yeah,
this,
yeah. So maybe
but
that can
this
help. I don't know.
it does.
I always try and think
It
positive,
was
but
good. It forced
yeah.
me to get out of my house,
Oh, okay.
because I
Well, that's
never
good.
leave the house. I'm not writing songs. I'm not making music. I'm not designing
Yeah.
anything.
Wow.
And it's been like that for 6 months or so.
Wow. Wow.
So, from this perspective, when I look back at how I was between
Mm.
2017 and 2022, writing and releasing all those songs, I'm thinking, like, maybe I was a bit high that whole time,
It's possible.
And
It's interesting. I mean, it sounds to me, I mean, this is clearly, I don't know anything about this, but it sounds like a person with with what you're describing, you probably can't get rid of it, right? I mean, as you meant, like, you probably can't get to a point where it's completely in your past. So you might have to learn how to manage it. Is that
well,
one way
it
to think
just makes
about
me
it?
wonder. It's because I always it's kind of important for me to know whether or not I was manic that whole time,
Yeah, yeah.
because like it is like a roller coaster of highs and lows. So, and the low is always much longer than the high. The high,
Mm.
you can't sustain that for very long. So, and
That's
you're,
what's so interesting about what you're saying about
yeah,
that
and
time,
you're
right?
burning so much
Yeah,
energy, right?
yeah.
So the low is inevitably longer. So I'm just worried that if I was like slightly high for 5 or 6
Are you gonna
years,
have 15
am
years?
I going to have a 10-year low
Yeah.
after it?
Wow,
So
interesting.
it's just
Yeah, boy,
it makes
that must be
the
daunting.
prospects look.
Yeah,
It's daunting, yeah. It
yeah.
makes the prospects look kind of bleak.
That's
Um,
interesting. I mean, that makes me think that if you did have to accept it, then is there a peace in the idea that, okay, well, I won't be able to get back to that state for perhaps years, but I can still get out of my house. I can still go and do a podcast. I can still do something with my life and make my life have some kind of meaning. I don't know if
yeah,
that
right
makes
now I'm all
sense.
about the baby steps.
Yeah,
I'm like, if I can go for a walk before noon,
yeah,
if I can walk 3 blocks, walk around my block, whatever, like that's something. I'm just really taking in like
yeah,
the
okay,
smallest things.
yeah.
And like everything I do, I have to break it down into tiny steps. If I'm sitting on the couch and I think that I have to wash the dishes, I'm like, okay, put one foot on the floor, put the
Right,
second foot on the floor,
literal baby
stand
steps.
up,
Yeah,
and like talk
yeah,
myself through every little step.
amazing.
It's like,
Yeah. Well, I'm impressed.
yeah,
I'm really impressed with that because it seems brave to me for you to leave the house. I know that I don't mean to compliment you overly, but it's just I know that like I've never been in such a state where I've been depressed where I didn't want to go out of my house, but not it never lasted for such a long time, and I never had to force myself to what you're describing.
yeah,
So yeah, like just to pay you a compliment, like it might be that if it's the best you can do to get out of the house and come over here and do a podcast, that's amazing. Like you could be like, hey, I did something, right?
yeah. No,
It's
I
you know what
really,
I mean?
yeah. Thank you, I appreciate it. No,
Yeah.
it was, it was something that I did have to push myself to do, and I have been trying to push myself to do more and get out more,
Right. Yeah.
and interact a little bit more. And also, I figured it was figured it was like a free therapy session.
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
could talk about my mental health.
Well, I'm also wondering if more than 10 people listen to this podcast. But my thinking was like maybe someone would listen to it and maybe learn something about because people are suffering from these things and they don't want to admit it
Yeah,
or they right,
exactly. There's still a bit of a stigma around
I
mental
think
health
so.
issues, and people don't feel comfortable talking about, their lows and stuff like that.
Definitely.
It's
And it's hard. I mean, like I think you mentioned a minute ago, or maybe a friend did yesterday, that like every person could benefit from therapy. I don't know if you said that a minute ago, or maybe that's just in my mind from a friend yesterday said that and my mom used to say this too, that every person could benefit from going to a therapist, because everybody going through life is going to run up against challenges and suffering, and this is back to the division you made. You have the condition aspect, which is harder to deal with than just the regular person who goes through life and just breaks up with their girlfriend, gets depressed, and has right. But it could be that talking about it publicly like this, there could be people who are suffering from that condition, who are not aware of it or not ready to admit it, and maybe they just need to hear somebody say that.
Yeah, and I
I don't
think
know,
even people who
right?
don't have a mental health condition have a lot to learn from listening to someone talk about what it's like to live with it, and if, you know, everyone knows someone with a mental
That's
health
true.
issue,
Yeah,
if they don't have it themselves, then someone in their lives does.
yeah,
So it's important that we talk about it and
yeah.
stuff.
The other thing I wanted to touch on, you mentioned how it went right through the pandemic. Like, this is a common thing that I run up against as an educator after the pandemic. After we went back, I noticed in my students, because my students are late teens, early 20s, most of them, that many more of them seem to have issues with. I wrote a whole article about this. I could send it to you about how, like, more anxiety. They would email me and say, "I'm just not." One girl, one time I went in to start the class, and a girl came up and was talking to me and said, "Sorry." And usually when I'm starting the class, I'm like busy doing stuff, and she said, and I looked at her face, and she was wearing a mask, but her eyes went up. I was like, "Okay, I better go talk to her." And we got in the house. She's like, "I'm having this panic thing. I can't stay." And everything. I knew she was telling the truth. So she went away, and she ended up actually not completing the course. And I noticed this as a higher thing, and I thought, this is probably a result of the pandemic.
Oh yeah, the
This is
pandemic messed
probably
everybody up.
right. I
That's
mean,
for
because
sure.
if you take a young person, right, a person who's in their teens and they're learning how to socialize and everything, and let's say they have a sort of already they're a little bit socially anxious, but and you shut them up in a house for a year and a half and put them in front of a screen, they're going to get more anxious. They're
Well,
going
one
to get, they're
thing
going to get, I'm talking about young people here. You're
I
not
think
young.
I
I'm not
think we
young.
take for granted too, like just how much courage it takes to do everyday
Yeah,
things,
it's true.
especially
Yeah.
like joining in with a group of people in a group activity. And before the pandemic, it was something we would do regularly and we didn't think about it so much anymore. But because it had become a habit, and
Yeah.
habits are easy, it's almost harder not to do a habit, right? So we were in the habit of getting together with people and everything was fine. But then you take that away for a couple of years, and then you're faced with doing it, and it becomes like a new thing again.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you realize like all that courage you were using that you took for granted, that it took
Well,
to like,
was it courage? It now takes courage to go back
yeah.
into that habit. It's a good question about if it's courage. I don't know. It
Yeah,
could be.
I
It
think
could
it
be.
does take courage to
Yeah.
like socialize and be social. You have to have you can't be insecure. You have to be confident. Um,
Yeah, yeah. What's one of I mean, I'm very distressed about the effects of the lockdowns. I think that I don't even like saying the term pandemic, because the pandemic was the virus that spread around the world that killed a lot of people. That was very dangerous. But what we're really talking about is our reaction to that by
yeah,
shutting everything down, which really are two separate things, because different places did different things, right? In
right.
Sweden or Florida, or whatever, they were not doing like here in Quebec. So there's very much an element there of choice, that we made those as choices. I just want to make that very clear for anyone listening. Those were not, the pandemic was a virus. Like, that was not a choice, right? There was no choice for that virus to come along. So we're dealing with the effects of those choices now. I think that's one of the things, especially places that, like, we had a pretty severe lockdown here
Well,
in
my
Quebec.
neighbor at the time, up until recently, was epidemiologist,
Yeah,
and I remember we were talking at the beginning of the pandemic, like the very, very beginning, before any kind of measures were put in place. Um, that he said he knew they were going to be lockdowns, and he could tell from statistics that there was going to be a rash of psychological
oh,
problems
interesting.
afterwards. It
Yeah.
was just like, It was a calculated risk, like
Yeah.
they knew, but they did it anyways to save lives, I
Well, maybe,
guess.
yeah. That's, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, there's a whole long question, but whether it did or not. I've heard similar things. I had a guy in my Uber once who was a recovering alcoholic, and he had his own business run on the plateau and stuff. And he mentioned this was in 2021 how some number of his friends, like 10 or a dozen, had committed suicide
Oh
who
my
were in
God.
recovery from alcohol and drugs. And he said, if you're a drug addict or an alcoholic, you need to go, if you're shut up alone, that's the worst thing that can happen. You're more likely, that's what he was explaining to me. And I
Hmm.
remember thinking, my God, when he told me that, it just was like a bomb hitting me of how awful that is it's an anecdote, so who knows how, right? I mean, you could also talk numbers, but anyway, okay. I just not sure. I mean, there's no way to conclude the effects of the pandemic on you. Do you think there was any effect?
At first, I thought no, because I was such a shut in, anyways.
Right?
Like, I
Yeah.
stopped going to bars a long time ago.
Mm.
I don't go out for coffee. Um, like my life was basically I was a stay at home hermit, even before the
Right.
pandemic.
So it didn't
So at the
have much. Yeah.
beginning, I thought, well, this is just business as usual. Now everyone is forced to live like me and see what my life is like. And I thought
That's
I was
funny.
adjusting really well, but
Well, you
just
just sorry to interrupt, but I just want to make clear what was interesting to me was you mentioned your creative streak went right through it, like you said, right through till last
yeah,
2022, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
that means that you were running on full on creativity mode
yeah,
right through the whole
yeah.
thing. So in that sense, it didn't affect your
Yeah,
right.
it didn't. But
Yeah.
after a while, it's like the domino effect. It started really affecting my friends,
I see.
and
Yeah.
all my friends started getting affected by it. And so I'm very empathic. So when my
Mm,
friends started suffering, I kind of started suffering in sympathy for them.
right.
And so I think eventually, yeah, it did.
That's really interesting that it had a kind of a circuitous route on. It took time because it took time for your friends because you weren't immediately affected. I was immediately affected as an educator.
Right, because
I was
you're,
sent home right away,
yeah, right,
and all this,
obviously,
and I had to
yeah,
adapt to Zoom, and I adapted. I figured it out and all that stuff, and of course then we went back, but it had so perhaps that immediacy made like in your case you were at home anyways,
yeah.
right?
It
Yeah,
wasn't a big shock for me.
yeah,
I wasn't sent home from work. I didn't.
right.
It didn't upend my life that much.
And then
Um,
later on, when your friends were the longer term effects on friends started to manifest themselves. You started to feel a sense of you as you
I
mentioned
just felt like
empathy.
the whole community was brought down by it psychologically. Like everyone just kind
Mhm.
of,
When you say community, you mean your community in
yeah,
NDG or just yeah, right,
my little
yeah,
section area of NDG, and all the people I know. I think just across the board, everyone was just down. And
yeah.
understandably so. And so
I totally agree. I think that I totally think your description. I think it's very interesting because it seems like by the time we got to the beginning of 2022, that was a kind of like I don't know how to explain this, but there was a breaking point. Like I mean, the whole trucker convoy came at that point.
yeah,
It was like in this country. I'm talking about in Canada. There was a kind of a that's it. We've gone too far with this stuff. Like it sounds like that coincided with your when you said earlier last year.
well,
You
yeah, the
right.
trucker
I'm not
convoy
saying the
was
convoy
kind of
caused your depression,
no,
but
but
yeah,
my
you know.
my mania coincided with the freedom convoy.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I did get very swept up in the whole drama that was going on and the debating around that, and I felt like there was just a lot of like nasty propaganda being circulated about the nature of the convoy and stuff like that, and
Spoiler alert: there was right,
I.
right. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, go
And
ahead.
I got into a big falling out with a fellow musician online on Facebook. It was quite overblown and dramatic.
Interesting.
And I ended up
Yeah.
writing a song about it that used his name
Oh boy.
and
Sorry,
posting it
that's not.
posting it
Yeah.
on my Bandcamp got my whole Bandcamp website shut down.
Oh
So
man.
that was like 5 years of work, like
Oh
hundreds of
no.
songs shut
Do you
down.
regret that? Because
I
you also
do,
you do,
yeah.
okay. But you were also, I mean, you're, I don't know, you're following a form of expression. Can you explain why they shut it down? Because you outed him
I
somehow?
really
Is
don't
that
want to like get
okay?
into the
All right, okay.
specifics
Sorry. Yeah,
because
I don't want to make you uncomfortable.
I did break the terms and conditions
Okay.
of
All right.
Bandcamp.
Okay. Okay.
And it was really overboard. Like I really went overboard in my disdain for this person's political views, and I really do regret it. You know, like
Okay.
I just feel like I should have just walked away from the outset from what he
Right.
said. I should have just kept my mouth shut and
Yeah, I'm a
kept
big yeah
scrolling.
yeah. Keep
Yeah,
scrolling, right? I mean, I'm a big. I should just be very blunt. I'm a big free speech promoter. I think free speech is like an extremely important thing, and I think it's the crux of many debates that are going on in the world. And it sounds like I would say that you were with. That's just my outside view. That you were within your rights. It may not be nice what you did, and you may regret it in the sense that free speech can include saying insulting things, but doesn't mean you should say them. Just because you're free to say something does not mean you should say it. I don't know if that makes sense, you know?
yeah, it does. And I think
Yeah.
the way I said it was not like malicious or I don't think I told any lies. I told the story of our disagreement in the song, and I
Okay.
don't think I said anything in the song that didn't happen.
But
Uh,
you still feel like you went too far
I
with
feel
the
like I
just
went too
yeah.
far. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. I'm you know, I appreciate you mentioning this. It's because it actually there's something I noted down I wanted to talk about was that, and this is seems directly connected to if we look at the political debates we see, especially on social media, there seems like we're almost living in a kind of bipolar society, you know?
Yeah,
Like,
well, it seems to be only the people on the extremes who are talking, you know, like no one,
yeah.
there's
Well,
no like voice
yeah.
of the moderate.
Well, it's sort of like I'm just, it's sort of like I don't know. I'm just gonna look at my notes here because this struck me as I was preparing for this. The way that some people, if you look at social media debates and and all this stuff, and the way that people are sorting themselves. Like I have a good friend who ran for the People's Party, who's a French Canadian local guy, and he was one of these people who was anti lockdown, blah blah blah, all this stuff. And he set himself a deadline. He said, if the Legault government gets elected again with a majority, I can't live here. Like I just can't live in a place like this. And he's gone to live in Florida. This guy,
Okay.
And so we're seeing this, and it's just one person, but this I find terrifying that people are sorting themselves geographically depending on what their political views are because I mean, if we live in a community, if someone has a different political opinion, they're still my fellow citizen, right?
Yeah.
I shouldn't view that person as an evil person just because they have a different political view from me, right? You know what I mean? And this is what struck me about. I was reading the NDG Echo article, very very good article. I recommend anyone out there listening should read that. It's by what's the woman's name?
Julie Petit.
Right. She's Paul Gott's. Uh, she's somehow connected to Paul Gott.
She's Paul Gott's ex-wife, and
Okay.
she used to write for the Montreal Gazette.
Yeah, this is
Yeah.
in the NDG Echo, and it's I don't know. The title I forget. Could you
It was something about Newfound Zen. John
Newfound Zen
Jordan's
John?
new.
So if you Google NDG Echo John Jordan Zen, it's very well written. But this description in there about the way that you saw or people suffering bipolar see like good and evil, like this kind of like
Well,
there's
that's
no
just
right.
me. I can
Yeah.
only speak for myself. I wouldn't say that's how everyone with bipolar sees things, but yeah, when I have these manic episodes, I sometimes think that there's this like war on Earth between angels and demons, and
Yeah.
everyone's on one side or the other, and I kind of like I'm in this constant state of evaluating like what side people are on, if they're on the side of the angels or the side of the demons.
And
And
you
everything is all
presumably are on the
blended.
side of the angels.
I don't even
Yeah, you
know.
don't
I
know,
don't even know
right?
myself.
Because whenever I hear people who talk like this, like people sort of hardline religious people or whatever, it's always like they're always on the side of the angel, which is like, how do they know that? Like if I'm on the side of the angels, how do I know I'm on the side of the angels? How could I be like just when I think about myself, right? I could be one of the demons, right? I mean, if half the people are angels and half are demons, then there's a 50% chance that I'm a demon, right? So
Yeah, I
you know,
oscillate between both. But yeah,
well,
it's very disturbing.
Well, I was struck by reading that because this is something we see more and more on like the way people argue about mostly political things. There's this kind of like if you have this opinion, you must be there's something must be something evil about
Yeah,
you.
there's
You
this
can't,
thing
right?
about judging people's character based on their opinions.
Right, right.
It's
And
like,
then putting them in an evil or a good
yeah,
camp. Like you're on the right side of history, you're with BLM or whatever it is, like you're or whatever. If you're on the right side, it would be, well, you're not woke, like you're fighting the woke, or you know what I like. I'm not even
yeah.
taking a side here. Like I don't want to sound like I'm just saying that type of almost bipolarity seems to have become a part of our social discourse, if that makes sense. I don't know. I mean, do
I
you
wonder
think
if it's
that?
just human nature to like somehow divide up and take sides, if
Yeah,
that's just like hardwired into us, we have to like there always has to be an other.
right, right.
There's us and them, and it's always and that's like what I was doing all the time was like, are they an us or are they a them? And
Yeah. So you would basically imagine you would evaluate every interaction in the sense of whether the person was on the side of the angels or on the side of the evil,
yeah.
something like that, and then right.
And it wasn't
Yeah.
even didn't even have to be interactions. I would just stare at people walking on the street and like try and imagine what they were. It was really
That's amazing. So how would you do that? You would look at a person, you judge the way they're
the
dressing,
way they're
or
dressed, the way they
yeah,
hold themselves, weird, like
wow,
strange criteria that I can't even remember now that I would be using to evaluate people. I don't know.
that's really interesting. Yeah, I guess that just strikes me as part of the mental illness would be. It sounds like it took over your whole being. Like, in other words, everything that you're looking at and seeing in the world has to go through that good evil lens, including the people on the street and when you're interacting, right? Does that
Yeah,
seem
yeah,
reasonable to
yeah,
say?
for sure.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know how to think about that. I mean, I'm struck by that. Just to close the thought about this social bipolarity, I think it's somewhat of a dangerous thing that we're in. I don't want to make too much of it
But I
because
don't think it's
yeah,
anything new.
that's
I
probably
think
true.
I think
Yeah.
it's I think we've always been that way. Maybe there's this perception now that we see it like printed out in black and white on social media. It's quantifiable now. We
Yeah.
can almost
Yeah.
measure it.
Mm,
But
that's true.
I think we've
Yeah.
always been like that.
Definitely, yeah. Well, when you look back at religious wars in Europe, you see a similar thing. Often, it seems to have more in common with a religious form of thinking than a secular one. It seems
Hmm.
like a kind of thing when you see people because when you have a religious view, you can't, like, if you believe something religiously, it's not like, okay, I believe this because I've reasoned it out. That's not how it works. You believe it because it's the right thing to believe, right? So I think there's a bit of that going on too. There's a kind of a religious way of viewing these political things that I think is very unhealthy. I sometimes wonder if some people might do better just going to church on Sundays. Not me. I'm an atheist, but one thing you mentioned in this article is a very good article about you've lost friends. You mentioned this earlier, and you mentioned this thing about how you had friends who were loyal, and I wanted to just talk a little bit about the role of loyalty in a friendship. I mean, how do
Yeah, it's very
yeah,
interesting. Like I said in the article, when I first got diagnosed and had my first manic episode in 2001, um, nearly all my close friends, except for one, this guy Rupert Bottenberg, who's a local artist, really just didn't want to have anything to do with me. And Rupert really stuck by me and like helped me out a lot. But then there were all these like sort of secondary friends, people I didn't know so well, that really stepped up to help,
interesting.
which was really eye opening.
And your
Um,
closer friends that you had at the time did not support you
they
as
didn't know how
much,
to deal with it,
right?
and they were too close. And so what I really learned in like, that's why a lot of the times, like if you look at an organization like AMI Quebec, which is a mental health group focused on the families of
Mm,
people with mental illness more than the people with mental illness
interesting.
themselves.
Right.
And they teach the families how to cope with their family members who have
Right.
mental illness,
Right.
because it's so much harder when there's emotional baggage,
Mm,
to see someone in that kind of psychological distress. Like, you almost need someone who's more detached to come in
right.
and lend a hand, because it's too painful, because you've got so much
Yeah.
love and care tied up in this person, and to see them suffering like that is just heartbreaking. So you need someone sometimes who's a little more detached, doesn't have as much of an intimate connection with the person, to kind of step in and say, okay, I'm gonna like hold your hand through this,
So that's really interesting. So the people who were closer to you, they were obviously ill-equipped to do that. They
Yeah,
weren't aware of that, so they were less likely to help you. And these people who were further away from you were better equipped, perhaps because they had less of a direct, tight connection to
exactly.
you as
Yeah,
well, right?
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, boy, that really has nothing to do with loyalty exactly. Then
No,
it's
it's
right.
yeah, you kind of think like the onus is on the people who are closest to do the heavy lifting.
That would be the immediate
That would be
assumption,
the
right?
immediate,
Yeah,
but they're really the
yeah,
least qualified people to
yeah.
do it. It's a lot like how a lot of times, sadly, like when our parents are growing older, the kids are not the best qualified people to take care of the
Yeah,
parents, because the parents never stop looking at them as their little babies.
right, right.
So
Yeah.
they can't
Wow.
accept them as authority figures in their life, right? So
Wow.
that's why,
That's
unfortunately, like is the case with my mother, I can't take care of my mother. She would never let me take care of her. So she has to live in a nursing home because she can't take care of herself. And,
she wouldn't allow you to
I'd
be
be,
the one, right?
no, she would block me at every turn,
Right, right. Yeah.
So
Not
I'm
wouldn't
just,
allow you, but just it would create a kind of enmity between you two if you were somehow forced into this because some families actually do end up in that situation.
yeah, yeah.
I have one friend who is kind of going through this. It's a very difficult time where there's exactly this dynamic going on between the parent and the child, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's really tough because there's a great guilt being the the child. Like you feel like, well, my job as a child too is my parent is now growing older. I should that's how I felt with that's how I have felt with both my parents. I feel like I should be doing more. My mother passed away early last year.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thanks. And I tried. She had grown up in Montreal. She didn't live here anymore. So I had tried for a very long time for her to come, to come back and live, so we could help her. Right, my wife would go over, and she wanted to. She would come and look at things and the property and stuff, and then go away again. And it was just exactly as you described. It was impossible for her, I think, and maybe for me, it was hard too. To kind of turn the relationship around because when a person becomes unable to take care of themselves, that's terrifying in and of its own right. But maybe it's more terrifying if the person that you babied is the one that if they're the one coming and doing that to you. That might make it more terrifying, perhaps. I
Yeah,
don't
I think
know.
it's just biology. I think, there's just we're not wired for our kids to take care of us,
Yeah, yeah.
because we're supposed to be taking care of them. That's the way we're wired.
On the other hand, I mean, just to flip it around a little bit, there are millions of people around the world. That's the common way
That's the
that people
custom,
live.
yeah, for sure.
In my
Yeah,
wife's country, in the Dominican Republic, their multi-generational households are the norm, and somehow that seems to, I don't know, maybe they have the same types of psychological issues in those environments. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to think about that. Like, why is it more of a problem for us than it is for how many thousands of generations have gone before us? Like I don't
I
know.
think it's still a problem, but it's just a cultural thing that's what you do. You put up with it.
Hmm. And we have a more individualistic way of framing things. I think
Yeah.
is part of it. Yeah. Okay. Um. Okay. Let me just see here. I had a couple of things I wanted to talk about before we move to music. Yeah, this the fact of being depressed. We were chatting about this yesterday, I think, on using on chat, and you mentioned something that I've experienced briefly, which is a terrifying thing where I'll be very anxious or just not feeling very good or something, and I'll put on music and I won't enjoy the music, and it's very very frightening to me. And I always feel like, what's wrong? I'm not. This is a song I love listening to. It normally makes me feel really good, and I'm just hearing it. It sounds like any other boring song that I would.
Right.
And you mentioned this too, that you couldn't take enjoyment with
Yeah,
things, right? Is
it's
that
never been quite this bad before. Like when I've been through depressions, like I just find no joy in anything. I don't I
yeah,
don't like listening to music. I don't like eating food. I don't like having sex. I don't like
yes.
watching TV and movies. I don't get anything out of it. Um, I
What do you do? I mean, what because
I
that's
just
that's a
kind
lot
of
of stuff
I
that's eliminating a lot of my
I
life.
put on TV shows I've already seen and leave them
Okay,
on just
all
for
right.
background noise while I doom scroll on my phone. That's
Okay,
like
yeah.
what my
So
days are filled with.
familiarity seems to be soothing, maybe. Is that
Yeah,
one way to
like
think about it? Is that
yeah, something I don't have to pay attention to. That's
right?
just kind of taking
Right.
up space in the background to keep me from just being alone with my thoughts. You know, something to just fill in the space between my ears. That's basically
Yeah. Do,
all I
do you
do.
know what, I mean, what do medical professionals say about this? Like, is you may have more experience with psychologists and doctors and stuff.
Well,
Have you ever asked
they
them what
just
type?
prescribe you drugs.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know,
Okay.
that's it. So I decided I'm taking an antidepressant for the first time in 20 years. I've always been very leery of them, you know, because I
Hmm.
don't want to have a manic episode.
Hmm.
Because when I first, that's how I got into this mess was in 2001. I was depressed and they prescribed me an antidepressant, but they didn't think I had bipolar. So they didn't prescribe me a mood stabilizer to go along with it to keep me from getting
Going
manic.
right up the
So I was
top.
on this antidepressant for a couple of weeks, and then it was like a 3 month long acid trip after that.
Wow.
So I've always
Oh,
been very
oh.
reluctant to try them, but
When you say a 3 month long acid trip, do you literally mean you were not hallucinating, but just the way that LSD changes your perception? Like, were you?
yeah, it was not
So,
hallucinating, but definitely being like not in this reality for 3 months, you know, and thinking
wow,
I thought I was a superhero and I was fighting crime and
wow,
and all this
wow.
stuff.
So that came from the antidepressant that was
Yeah,
not mixed with a mood stabilizer. Yeah. Do you feel that because this is what my question is? I'd like to understand why is it that our senses would be so deadened that things that you would normally that I like that has happened to me in very tangential ways. For you, it's going on for a long time. I'm just really sort of curious about the mechanics of that in our brains. Because I don't know. They don't tell you. They just tell you to take antidepressants. They don't have any.
yeah, pretty much. And to
Yeah,
get out, get exercise, eat well, all the
all the
basic stuff,
usual.
all the
Yeah,
usual stuff.
yeah. Okay.
So
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know how to think about that, but okay. I want to go to the music in just a little bit, but this another thing about you that I found in my research is this courtyard in your building, which has a bunch of paintings of cats and
yeah, it's
cats that
called the
live there.
Alley Cat Gallery.
Yeah, this is a really cool thing.
I live in NDG in Montreal on Sherbrooke Street West, between Harvard and Wilson, and I live in a complex of four buildings that surround a little courtyard. And I've been there since 2008, and we were always getting tagged by graffiti. Just the tags, nothing really nice or anything. And I felt bad for. We have two landlords for the four buildings, and they were always having to clean the graffiti off. And some of the graffiti that they were never able to clean off said "Kill my landlord" on one wall.
Wow.
And
Okay.
I was there for years and years, and it was a constant problem. Like we were getting new tags all the time. And in 2013, first I took in a cat. I adopted a cat from the SPCA named Humbert, He was a 2-year-old Maine Coon cat. And then that was in on April 20th. And then on September 1st, I took in a roommate who was this guy who was, he did a lot of construction type stuff. He was a building manager for a big real estate company. And so in 2014, after they'd both been there for like a year, we were just sitting in the courtyard having beers and watching them clean the graffiti off the walls. And we just kind of started brainstorming over like what we could do to deter the graffiti. So first we thought, oh, why don't we paint a mural? And we thought, well, it's kind of permanent.
Over it. Yeah.
We'll never get permission, And so we were like, what can we do that's not permanent and we wouldn't need permission to do? And someone, as it happened, threw out like a kitchen table, a round circular kitchen table. And I said, why don't I paint a design on that tabletop and we'll just screw it to the wall. And if they don't like it, we'll just unscrew it and take it off. And so we decided to do that. So I painted this design, which was like a yin yang with a black cat and a white cat. And in the dead of night, at the end of September that year, we just put it up on the wall. And
can I just quickly ask you? Yeah. So you took off the tabletop.
Yeah, just the tabletop.
So you separated the legs. So you had this basically a flat tabletop that you could paint on, and it was round.
Yeah.
And you made a circle on it that had a yin yang, and you drew some cats in there, and then you mounted it up on the wall in the middle of the night. Right. That is so cool, man. That's great.
I chose the yin yang because my landlord is Vietnamese, the other landlord is Chinese, and the businesses around us are Chinese and Korean. So I figured the yin yang would kind of like appeal to everyone. And lo and behold, they really liked it. They thought it was really cool. And we said, do you mind if we keep putting up pictures?
So you did it clandestinely. But figuring that they would not like it, or they would, because, I mean, clearly, if they didn't mind it, you could just put it up in the middle of the day, right?
Our philosophy was, it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
What's that? It's an expression, right? Yeah. Better to beg for forgiveness than ask for permission.
Yeah, that's what we went with.
Yeah. I'm just making sure. I just want to say something. So this is Sherbrooke West, because I know there's a Korean supermarket around there somewhere. It must be.
That's at Beaconsfield. Yeah,
Beaconsfield. Is that nearby?
It's about 6 blocks away.
Okay, yeah. So I know that area. It's a very nice. I have friends who live in NDG, and our mutual friend Graham lived in NDG for a very long time. He's now, shout out to Graham Ford.
Hey, Graham.
If he's listening to this. Okay, so then the landlord liked this. They turned, like, you figured, right, that you thought they might or might not or whatever, but so you did it clandestinely. They liked it, and what did they know it was you? How did they know it was you?
There was no one else in the building who would have done it.
Okay, so, right, yeah. So no other sort of musician type people or artistic.
We had already started. That summer, we had put out a table in the courtyard and some chairs. And since I was working from home, I spent a lot of time there. And it became quite popular with the other neighbors. They would come down and we'd gather in the courtyard and have drinks and stuff like that all summer. So they kind of knew. And I had already started, because I wanted to train my cat to be an outdoor cat, right? So before, I had never much spent time in the courtyard, which everyone calls an alley because it's kind of very narrow, and it looks like a back alley, and it's often full. It was at the time often full of trash.
So you'd sit out there with your cat.
So I'd go out with my cat on a leash and like train him to go outside. I did that for like 3 or 6 months or something. And so I started getting a little bothered by the decrepit state of the alley, because people would do drugs there. They'd hole up in one of the doorways and drink booze there. They'd go to the bathroom in the alley. It was really gross,
But if you're sitting there, they wouldn't do that.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's why I decided to put a table out and stay out there with my cat all day and there was
you're like the neighborhood watch.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great, man.
And there was a florist next door, so I started buying plants from the florist and hanging them from the fire escapes and stuff like that. And we had plants everywhere. So it was pretty obvious that if anyone was going to put something up on the walls, it was me. So the landlord's like,
Right, right,
you
right.
know,
Okay. So the landlord figured it out. That's really cool. So the landlord if if I'm a landlord, so I understand the positive aspect of having a tenant who is present and making my building a better place, right?
hmm
And the landlord may have thought, well, this guy's, kind of an artistic kind of a guy, but he's cleaning up the courtyard and he's got, there's because the landlord doesn't want people peeing and
no,
defecating and doing drugs and everything outside his building either, right? Presumably, it's not so,
yeah, no,
right?
no, they were very grateful. Um, in fact, when I had my manic episode in 2019, um, I wrote "kill my landlord" on my Facebook page, and someone told my landlord because he's not on Facebook,
Oh
and
boy!
they tried to use that as the basis to have me evicted.
Wow,
So I had to go to the regie. I had to go to the rental board,
really?
and I won. I didn't get evicted, so that was good. But
Can I just quickly stop you for a second? The charge was that you had made some sort of a death threat, and they would.
yeah, on Facebook, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
But
Forgive me, but that again back to my free speech thing is like what? I mean, it's obvious that you didn't really mean it. That seems clear, right?
right,
I don't know.
so
Did they
um,
actually get up in the regie and present and say, "Well, Mr. Jordan was making a threat. I felt it's for my safety." Did they ever
no, he didn't even say he
no,
didn't push it very hard. It was mostly his. He has partners. He's part of a like real estate group. You know,
right,
they own a
right.
bunch of buildings, and he didn't push very hard at all.
That's good. That's good. Okay,
And we're on good terms now. We talk all the time.
that's good. Okay.
He's apologized for taking me to court.
Oh, that's nice. Okay, I'm
Yeah,
glad you can work it out. The reason because this is sort of a bugbear of mine, the human rights commissions I find to be like any time when you have a court structure that doesn't have the regular rules of innocent till proven guilty, you can have. It sounds like in this case he didn't abuse it the way that like the Mike Ward case, for example, right? So
yeah,
it makes me think of when you have an extra judicial court, let's say, there can be abuses. This is a bit of an odd sort of sideline case there. Okay, so what about music? Let's transition to music as we move towards closing. What are your main influences? Like when you were, because you were, or you still are with Me Mom and Morgentaler, right?
well, we're not active anymore. We aren't doing anything these days. My big influences growing up were the Beatles and Kiss
Kiss.
and
Yeah.
Queen and AC/DC and
Okay. Yeah.
David Bowie and the
Yeah.
Beatles.
The Beatles. Yeah. Okay. Um,
But my big influence for becoming a musician was Fishbone. Was the big
Fishbone.
band for
Yeah.
me. Their frontman's very dynamic and flamboyant saxophone player, and he really inspired me to want to play live for
Okay,
sure.
interesting. Yeah, I have a recollection of Fishbone. They were big, I guess, in the '90s or the '80s, and I
In the
remember the music.
'90s, yeah,
I think I had a couple of their records. I remember really liking. They were a very unique sound,
yeah,
But you're talking about their performance. That
yeah. Their
was
performances
right.
were crazy. You know, so much energy and just great dancing and
So that was the thing that made you want to get up on the stage and
yeah,
do kind
for
of
sure.
copy them, kind of thing. Do something because we all start out by copying,
Yeah, them and the
right?
Specials. The Specials did that for me too. Um, and I saw them both for the first time around the same time.
Okay. So this is around 80s or
86, around
86. Yeah.
86, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. It didn't the specials? They're sort of not in the news, but didn't one of them just pass
The
away?
singer just passed away, Terry
Yeah.
Hall. Yeah, just
Right.
passed last week,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah. The specials are a group that I sort of never really figured out. I was really into a lot of punk and a lot of British stuff like the Clash and stuff like that. But the specials were kind of on a parallel track to the Clash and the Sex
Oh,
Pistols,
very
kind
much.
of,
Yeah,
right? They
especially the
were,
Clash. Yeah, there's a lot of
yeah.
parallels between the Clash and the Sex Pistols. Yeah.
Well, there's the reggae. I mean, because I listen, I don't know what it is about the specials. I just can't get into. I don't know why, because I can hear they're really good. It's just that they're a very unique sound. But because I went and listened to, because they have this song called Monkey Man,
Right.
right? And so I went and listened to it. I was like, I know that song. It's one of their famous hits. But I thought it was like, are they covering the Rolling Stones? Like, and
No,
it's
totally
not.
something.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And so anyway, but their sound is, first of all, when I was listening to it that the other day, I could hear the Afrobeat, I could hear the reggae and ska, like they were a ska band, right?
Right.
So there's a whole Jamaican influence there that is really, and I noticed in your music, you've got a lot of that in the things I've
Oh,
listened
for
to.
sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure, for sure. I'm very still very much influenced by ska and punk and the Clash and the Specials.
And reggae as well, like Jamaican stuff. I mean, is it?
Oh yeah, for
Yeah,
sure. I do a
yeah.
lot of I used to do a lot of recording with this guy Tim Dubb, who was the drummer for the Planet Smashers a long time ago when he was young, and then he went into producing. And he lived in Jamaica for about 10 years,
Wow.
up until a few years ago. And he would come up twice a year to Montreal, once in the summer, once in the Christmas time. And we would get together, me, him, and a bass player at a studio in Montreal West, and we would just record instrumentals.
Wow.
Tim would
Nice.
play guitar, keyboards, and drums. Tony would play bass, and I would play sax. And we would just crank out, like, we would probably do, in a month, we would do like 40 instrumentals.
Wow. Nice.
And then Tim would take those back to Jamaica and get Jamaican singers to sing on top of them.
Oh, that's so
And
cool,
he worked
man.
with this guy's Luton Faya is pretty big. We had a video we did with Luton Fire that got like 2.5 million views.
Is he the guy? Because I like the one video I've seen Graham did. It's sort of a jokey song. It's all good in NDG.
Yeah, that's our
Is that
song.
him?
No, that's my
Okay,
song.
because
That's
there's a
Mellow
black
G.
guy in the car with
That's
the
Mellow
dreads.
G. Yeah,
Okay,
he's an
yeah.
NDG, a
Okay,
reggae singer. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
okay, yeah. Okay, so that's not the guy who lives in Jamaica part of the time.
No, but
Okay.
they've worked together.
Oh,
They've worked
okay.
together
Okay.
before. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, I'm sort of fascinated with Jamaica as a sort of a place for in the world of music. Let's say a lot of. I mean, I love music from Jamaica. For one thing, I did a whole podcast with a guy who's sort of an expert in Jamaican music and punk. Martin Deck of Windsor, Ontario, was kind of and one of the things about Jamaican like Studio One and the time in the is that there was this huge not overproduction but just enormous amount of music coming out of it, so
Yeah.
much, right? So and I remember reading once about how Jamaica, this was back, it was on some liner notes about how more music was produced in Jamaica, this is in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, per person like than any other country in the world, right? You think, and you sort of wonder, like, what's going on? There's something about the particular Jamaica has these unique things about it. It's got like hot runners, right? There's these fast runners that come. Like, what is that? Like, is that, you know what I mean? Why is so much music? It's kind of these
Yeah, yeah.
questions. Little island in the Caribbean nobody cares about. It's got these funny, and yet it's all messed up. Like, it's like really screwed up with like drugs and problems and stuff. It's very interesting contradictions. Have you ever been there?
No, I've never gone. I've always wanted to go.
You should go visit your friend.
Yeah, for sure.
Might be something interesting
Yeah,
to.
I have. Well, Mellow G's uncle is a friend of mine. This guy named Biggs, and Biggs is building a house down there.
Nice.
So he says he's going to take me once the house is ready, and I'll have a place to stay. So
That
something
would
I'm
be
kind of
really
looking
cool. I
forward
mean,
to. Yeah.
it's I'm kind of thinking that if you're gonna sort of, I don't know, it would kind of like give you something to do, right?
Yeah,
Like, right?
yeah,
It's not expensive to fly there, and then if you have a place to stay, right?
yeah, for sure.
So,
And he knows all the musicians down there, right?
oh
Like he
man.
knows Bears Hammond is good friends with, and so
So
I'm
you
sure
could,
I'd get to meet a lot of people, and get to probably play in the studio while I was there.
man, that is so cool. Bring your sax
Oh,
and
for sure.
yeah, man. Okay. All right. Well, I'm sort of thinking as we move towards closing, if you do that, I'd love to have you back on to talk to you about that.
For sure.
That sounds like something that could be the basis of. About music, I mean, first of all, you mentioned Me Mom and Morgentaler. First thing I want to ask you about Me Mom and Morgentaler is because I knew them, and they were around when I was a younger person. They were popular. I've always loved the name. The name is a very how shall I put this? Very politically incorrect. If anybody doesn't know, there was a man called Morgentaler who had an abortion clinic in Montreal in the 70s and 80s, sometime when abortion was still not legal. So it was a very controversial thing. This is a really long time ago. So obviously you're making a kind of a very crude, I don't know how to make a joke or,
Well,
I don't know. Is that,
when the band was formed, they were most of them were. I wasn't in the band at the very beginning. I was just friends with them. But most of them were going to Marianopolis,
okay?
the CJEC,
Yeah,
the college, Marianopolis College,
yeah,
and they put the band together to perform at Talent Night that they
okay.
were also organizing. And they wanted to come up with a name that would piss off the nuns at the school. So they were like, now how
What's a way to say something that's going to
yeah, exactly,
really get a nun to get upset, which
yeah.
probably isn't that hard if he just makes anything about religion, right?
Yeah, how they
Yeah.
got from that concept to Me, Mom, and Morgentaler, I'm not entirely sure. But the nuns thought it was hilarious.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's always
But they wouldn't
yeah.
let them play the cafeteria under that name. They
Okay.
drew the line.
Okay. Yeah.
The talent show was at the McGill Union Ballroom, but then later they were going to play the cafeteria and they wouldn't let them put up posters with the name. But a lot of places
That's
took
great.
offense at the name. Like, we could never play the Maritimes.
Really?
Because that's where
Really?
Morgentaler
Yeah.
was in jail. He was in jail in Nova Scotia
Okay, I
for
didn't
the
know that.
clinic in Halifax. Yeah, so he did jail time in the Maritimes.
Wow,
So
that I
it's
didn't know.
still a
Interesting.
very conservative
Yeah, maritime
landscape.
Canada, I could imagine, and this is in the 90s, I'm
Yeah,
thinking, right? So that things were, that's 30 years ago now, right? So
yeah.
people in maritime Canada, I don't know if you've ever been to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick.
Oh, I have
It's
family there.
wonderful.
That's where my mom is. Yes, in Nova
Okay,
Scotia.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's a more sort of, especially New Brunswick in particular, is very socially conservative, and Nova
yeah.
Scotia seems a bit different. Halifax seems sort of hip and cool and everything, and then there's more sort of what's the word?
Rural.
Rural, socially
Yeah,
conservative
yeah.
backbone in the countryside. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. Just you mentioned that you're going to have a 30th anniversary for that album. The
Shiva
name
Space Machine.
Shiva. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, do you have anything planned for that? You
No, I
anything
just put
set?
it. I just made it free on our
Oh yeah.
Bandcamp site and announced it yesterday. So it'll be
Okay.
free all year if you want to download it and stuff
Okay.
like that.
All
Yeah,
right. Yeah, it's a good album. Well,
yeah.
yeah, I was listening to a bunch of stuff because originally we were going to talk more about the music of that, but what about just a couple of things? The music interacting with the changes in your mental health now. I mean, going forward, like, do you feel that music can help you? Do you play sometimes that when you're
I
at
never
home?
play.
You
I
don't play,
never just pick up the sax or the guitar or anything and
really?
blow or strum. I just don't. I just
And that's
don't
just
do
the
anything.
depression.
It's
Just
just the
yeah,
depression. Yeah,
yeah, interesting.
just not moved to do it at all. I have a. I'm surrounded in my building by musicians. My guitar player lives upstairs, and I have a great keyboard player, drummer who lives next door. And
What
I
happens when they come knocking on the door and go, "Hey, John, let's jam for a while"? You just like,
they know
yeah.
not to ask
Right, right,
anymore.
okay,
They
yeah,
know.
okay,
They know I'm just not up for it.
okay. So there's no way that's not going to work as a kind of a therapy. It's just nah,
Maybe one day,
yeah,
maybe I'll
yeah.
come back to it. I hope I come back to it.
So do I, because you're a good musician. I mean,
Thank you.
you are, and I don't want you to feel like I'm trying to guilt you into it, but just it's like objectively true that you're a good musician, right? So like the world is a less interesting place with you not playing, right? And but that's up to you, right?
Yeah,
You have
well,
to think about you more than the
exactly.
world,
I just
right?
gotta baby steps, left foot,
That's
right
it.
foot.
That's yeah. Maybe
Yeah.
reach for the sax and something like that, right? Yeah. What about music? I mean, just what do you think about music generally, like in the world today? Like, popular music and different kinds of things that we hear, what people are listening to. I mean, do you have any comments on what?
I don't really listen to
Yeah,
much new music.
no,
I don't like Spotify. I kind of refuse to use it on moral grounds. So I never just like throw up, shuffle on Spotify and pick a new artist playlist. And I don't really know what's going on out there.
right,
Really,
right.
I'm
Can
a
you?
very typical like older middle-aged man who just listens to the stuff he knows and like doesn't,
Yeah, because
you know.
I'm very torn with that because we probably listen to a lot of the same stuff. I mean, the stuff you mentioned earlier, the Rolling Stones and AC/DC and all that kind of stuff. And I love listening to Brian Jonestown Massacre. I have certain things that I listen to when I'm doing things that seem to help me do them, my mind, and that's one of them. But I also try and listen to new trends and new developments just because I'm always curious about what's going on. And there usually are things happening. It's always surprising to me that there still actually is good music. It's kind of like, wow, that sounds kind of good. And it's like came out last year or something. But
What do you listen to when you're like
well,
Spotify or?
I usually, I usually, this is going to sound really funny, but I have a few radio stations because that's how there's a radio station in, it's 94.7 that's in Cornwall because I drive, right? And this station is, I think it's on the reserve there, Akwesasne. Like I think it's, and so they're a very interesting station. They play all kind of like pop hit music or whatever, and it's a very unusual station. There's no one language for the commercials. Like some of the commercials are in French, some are in English, which is really cool. Like it's like there's no other station in Montreal is like that. It's like English or French. It's very like um, sort of rigid that way. And I think what it is, I think what that station is they are on the Indian Reserve, so they don't have to follow the Canadian content regulations. I think that's what it is. And so they,
Okay.
they have mostly just, and so every once in a while I hear something on there. I'm like, wow, that's really, really good. Like some rap or pop or something. Um, yeah, but that's basically how it. And also, I have like some younger friends who plug me. Well, one of my former students plugged me into this thing called UK drill, which is a kind of a new form of sort of rap music in Britain. It's really, really good. It's
Oh
like
yeah.
if you like the Specials, man, like it's kind of like it's more like rap and hip hop in some senses, but very British. Like they all have British accents, and so stuff like that.
Is that the name of the genre or the group?
Genre, yeah,
Yeah.
UK drill. Because that's the other thing about music today is it's so bifurcated into different genres, and like there's like when you get into some of the Latin forms, there's a dembo and reggaeton, and they sub into all these other subcategories. Oh,
Yeah,
that one's
yeah.
in Puerto Rico, and that one's in or whatever. Like it's really hard to kind of keep up with all the different
Hmm.
music. I think people are the idea of the mass format that we grew up with, where there was like, it was a big band that would be touring. That doesn't seem to be the case now. There's all,
No.
people are kind of into what they're into. They're into K-pop or they're into reggaeton or whatever. That UK drill stuff. There's a guy called Russ Millions, who's really one of the UK drills, really good. And I was like, who never heard of this guy? Go and look him up. He's touring around the UK to packed places in Britain, like big theaters, and he's no one's ever heard of him here,
You'll have
right?
to send me some of
Yeah,
those links.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Um. All right. Anything else that you'd want to add about music, just before we close? Any? Yeah.
I may not be doing much now, but I do have a website. It's ndgska.com. And that's got, pretty much all the music I've made in my career. It's a good sampling of where I've been and where I'm going. And yeah, it's up on Bandcamp. It's a Bandcamp website. So if you want to check that out, it's ndgska.com.
Cool. One thing I wanted to just before we close ask you about. You said you didn't like Spotify. Like, just what is it? I don't use Spotify, but
I just find
yeah,
what they pay artists is
really bad.
insulting, and yeah, the fact that they're getting rich off.
Have you seen the show about it?
No,
I don't know if you've heard about this. There's like a mini series of maybe 6 episodes all about and it ranges from the founding of Spotify in, where is it, Sweden? Is it Sweden?
I don't know.
Somewhere, and then it goes through it, and it goes heavily into this about how they don't not paying the artists, and then it actually extrapolates into the future, like up to like it goes past through 2023 up to like 2026 when they're having these hearings in Washington to force Spotify to like pay their artists more and all this stuff, right? So you might enjoy that. It's kind of like a Just Desserts, and kind of, yeah, it because you see, my father's a musician. He so I grew up in understanding how how do I put this? How not precarious it is, but just how hard it is for musicians to actually make a living, because it's hard to do. And he was able to do it, but he had to do other stuff. He had to teach and everything.
Well, like
And,
album sales just don't exist
yeah,
anymore, pretty much. Like no
yeah,
one buys albums anymore.
yeah.
Everyone streams everything for fractions of a penny at a time.
The YouTube streams are, I mean, it's insane. If you get like 1 million downloads, it's like $40 or something. I remember seeing the charts once, and I was like, "What? Like 1 million streams makes you $50 or something?" Like it's like it almost doesn't make any sense. Like how could it be that low? But I mean, I don't know. It's one of these things. Like, what's a solution to that? I have no idea. It's kind of like it's almost like the cat's out of the bag. Artists today, what they do is they make money from touring.
Yeah,
That's how
yeah,
that's how most of the big pop artists think.
yeah,
Have you seen the ticket prices for
yeah,
go to the Bell Center to see a show? Right?
yeah. It's absurd, but I mean, you can't blame them because, like I said, album sales don't exist anymore. It just isn't a revenue stream.
Yeah.
It's just gone.
Yeah. Okay. Listen, I want to thank you for a number of reasons. First of all, this has been really interesting. I also should just say it's I don't know that if I were in your position, I would be that brave, because I can't really imagine myself talking about something so deeply personal about myself. And that's not something positive about me, but it is something very positive about you. I think you should, what's the word? I mean, I think you should take it as a compliment that you
Oh, I
actually
do.
do that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I
It's
appreciate it, and I've had a lot of practice
really,
talking. Yeah, I've always figured like. Uh, I'd rather be upfront than try and
yeah.
hide something. I'd rather just have everything out on the table and let's talk about it and deal with it than try and pretend like everything's peachy.
Right, right, yeah. Well, it's very interesting because I could sort of imagine myself if I fell into a depression and I was depressed for a year or something and I came out of it. I could imagine myself doing a podcast talking about it, but I couldn't imagine while I was in like. And you've told me very openly, like, you're in this depression. It almost makes me say, "Wow, that's amazing that you're here." I mean, I'm like, and there's something incredible about it, because I think a lot of depressed people, they just want to hide. They don't
Well,
want to do
2 weeks
anything.
ago I wouldn't have been here.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay. So
I'm.
maybe, yeah.
There's still ups and downs within the ups and downs. So
Interesting.
you caught me on a good day.
Okay. All right. Yeah, this was a spur of the moment thing. Okay. So listen, thanks again. And I hope that, if I think that's a good plan, this thing, if you can get to Jamaica, I think that for, like, I'm just thinking for you, I would
Yeah.
think that would be really good for you to go down there for a couple of weeks or a month or something, and just whatever, maybe when you're feeling better or whatever, because if you're depressed, you're not going to want to go. I don't know.
No, I
But
wouldn't.
yeah.
Yeah.
But if that happens, man, I think that would be. I'd love to have you come and just tell me stories about Jamaica.
Well, hope I can.
All right, let's make that a goal for the
Okay.
future. All right, thanks, John. Thank you for listening to today's guest on the Mega Blast podcast. I've been your host, Jason McDonald. This podcast is brought to you by Arts and Opinion, an online journal, which is also available in the Permanent Archives of Canada. Visit us online at artsandopinion.com.
Thanks, Jason.